Okay. Well, thank you very much, Harvey and Jane, and indeed Louisa, who's going to be sort of piloting the screen. Now, it's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening, if only by the witchcraft that is Zoom technology. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet again in person shortly. Right. So, in preparing his 1635 map of Isleworth 100 for the Duke of Northumberland, a Dunstable-born Isleworth resident and mapmaker Moses Glover included a marginal note against Hounslow Heath. In this heath hath many camps been pitched, he wrote, whereof the form of 2 yet in part remaineth not far beyond this river. And by the river he meant the River Crane. Now this talk is going to explore something of the many camps located during the West London Landscapes project, an Historic England funded programme which rounds up the results of 10 excavations carried out between the rivers Colne and Crane in the London boroughs of Hillingdon and Hounslow over a nearly 20-year period between 1979 and 1997. Also, it's important to understand at the outset that much of this work was carried out prior to the introduction of PPG 16. And as a result, few of the sites attracted substantial developer funding. Now, the shape of the talk this evening broadly reflects the division of labour in the draft report that Nick and I have been working on. So I'll be dealing with the early prehistory down to the early Bronze Age and with the Iron Age and early Roman periods. Nick will deal with the later Bronze Age and the later Roman period. And in the 40 or so minutes, we cannot really do more than sketch in some of the highlights of the project, but we hope at least to give you a flavour of some of the results. First slide, please, Louisa. But this evening is not about us. It's about these two, Kirsty and Phil. Or, well, at least it's all about their catchphrase, location, location, location. And this famous view, next slide, please. This famous view taken from the top of Richmond Hill looking west, which I'm sure many of you will recognise, helps us to focus on location, as it provides what is in effect a distant view of the project area. The flat horizon, of course, gives the game away, for the project centres on the level expanses of the 3rd and 4th gravel terraces of the Thames. Next slide, please. Now, most of the sites examined actually lie on the 3rd or Taplow terrace in the area around Heathrow, which comprises a large portion of Moses Glover's historic Hounslow Heath. The northern part of the area is capped by a thick, undulating deposit of wind-blown loess, often referred to as brick earth, which Harvey mentioned earlier, shown as an orange tone on the map within that black box you can see on the screen. Now, while free draining and fertile, brick earth is not easy digging. It's prone to droughtiness in summer and waterlogging in winter, which makes archaeological features dug into it incredibly difficult to spot and deal with. Next slide, please. Now, following Grimes's pioneering work at Caesar's Camp in 1944, which Harvey again referred to in the introduction, many sites have been examined around the airport, as this map, which is now already well out of date, demonstrates. The West London Landscape Project sites are highlighted in red, while the earlier campaigns of Grimes in 1944, Canham in 1969, and Alexander and Farrant in 1971 are shown in black. Together, these precede the latest generation of major projects carried out around the airport at sites like Terminal 5, Imperial College Sports Ground, Prospect Park, RMC land at Harlington. The list is virtually endless. Very large numbers of sites have now been examined. Next slide, please. Now, unlike the higher gravel terraces further north, which have produced thousands of early flint tools, few have been recorded from the Taplow Terrace gravels. The most noteworthy find from our project is a late Neanderthal hand axe, which you can see top left, found towards the base of the brick earth at Woolgarden Farm in Sipson Lane. It dates to a period of human recolonisation of Britain around 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, and is one of a small number of late Middle Paleolithic pieces from the Thames Valley. The climate at the time it was made and used would have been intensely cold, as that rather fine artist reconstruction below it very clearly demonstrates. Now, unlike the Sipson hand axe, a small group of 5 flints from the terrace edge south of the airport, thought to date prior to 35,000 years ago, had not been sealed beneath brick earth. But together, these 2 small finds suggest that the pre-glacial maximum landscapes inhabited by Neanderthals and by early anatomically modern hunter-gatherers can survive given the right circumstances, both beneath the brick earths and at the margins of paleo channels along the terrace edge. Evidence for later hunter-gatherer activity is limited within the project area. It comprises no more than a handful of diagnostic microlithic points and a small chipped flint adze found during field walking at Home Farm, Harmersworth, on the bottom right of the screen. However, it may simply mean that hunting parties operating out of base camps in the valley floors, like the site there on Sanderson's near Uxbridge, they weren't leaving archaeologically recoverable traces in the woodlands that eventually came to dominate the terrace gravels. So the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of human absence. Next slide, please. Now, if evidence for hunter-gatherer activity is slim, the succeeding Neolithic is better represented, as the natural wildwood began to be cleared by pioneering farming communities. The earliest Neolithic signature on the West London Landscapes project is a small rectangular 2-bay house at Cranford Lane. You can see on the left of the slide. This lay amongst a tangle of features, many of which appear to mark the positions of trees. And crucially, the structure only survived because it lay beneath the ridge of an expanse of medieval ridge and furrow agriculture. That's those linear lines running across the screen in sort of brown. The structure is directly comparable in both size and form to 4 early Neolithic houses at Lower Horton, one of which is shown on the top right-hand side of the slide, Kingsmead Quarry, excavated by Wessex Archaeology. Now, these small structures, perhaps occupied by single extended families, can be contrasted with larger hall-like buildings. You can see a couple there on the screen at Yarnton and Whitehorse Stone by comparison. Traces of burning at the southern gable end of our building suggest that it might have been fired and abandoned. Possibly, who knows, on the death of one of the occupants? Difficult to say. And that a small place deposit of 2 scrapers and plain bowl pottery had been pushed down into the corner post hole at the opposite gable end. You can see over on the left-hand side of the screen, the red arrow there. Next slide, please. Now, individual groups of people, like the occupants of the Cranford and Horton houses, came together on occasion to construct larger communal monuments, including those of causewayed enclosure form. A possible example, which first showed up as a crop mark on aerial photographs taken in the late 1940s, was evaluated as part of the project at Mayfield Farm, East Bedfont, on the southeast side of the airport. And I put up the crop mark photograph, you can see centre slide. This enclosure, this double-ditched enclosure, lay on a low eminence at the very edge of the Heath Road terrace, which I've marked there, and overlooked a wide expanse of the Thames Valley to the south. Field walking across much of its interior produced a reasonably extensive lithic assemblage incorporating transverse arrowheads of later Neolithic form shown here on the left of the slide. Now, unfortunately, limited excavation of the wide U-shaped flat-bottomed inner ditch and the shallow V-sectioned outer ditch produced no conclusive dating evidence apart from a few sherds of later prehistoric pottery in the upper silts of the inner ditch. Also, of course, the differences in the ditch profiles could suggest that they were dug at different times. This may be a multi-phase monument here. Even so, dismissal of the site as a causewayed enclosure in the standard gazetteer on the form is, I think, probably perhaps premature. Our evaluation showed that further larger scale work is going to be required to properly elucidate it, presumably sometime in the future in the context of gravel extraction, who knows, although this site actually is one of very few in Greater London that's scheduled, so it does have legal protection. Next slide, please. Now, the plan on the screen, courtesy of Framework Archaeology, gives a visual summary of early Neolithic sites in the area. The houses, the small houses I've talked about, are marked with black rectangles, confirmed causewayed enclosures with red dots, and possible causewayed enclosures with purple dots. And note too the presence of the Stanwell Cursors complex at Terminal 5, just to the west of the site marked Cranford Lane. Now, there's currently a large gap in the distribution of causewayed enclosures along the Thames Valley, which, no surprise perhaps, corresponds with urban Greater London. The confirmed examples at Yovney Lodge Staines and Orsett in Essex are therefore separated by nearly 70 kilometres as the crow flies, and rather longer by river. So it seems very likely that there would originally have been others in between. And two plausible contenders lie on local highs overlooking the river at Twickenham and at Kew Bridge, further downstream. And you'll note that the site there at Church Street, Twickenham, is quite close to the confluence of the Crane and the Thames, and that the site at Kew Bridge is also quite close to the confluence of the Brent with the Thames, or not far away anyway, so interesting here. Both these sites, Church Street, Twickenham and Kew Bridge Road, Brentford, have produced ditch-like features containing plain bowl pottery and lithics. They're unlikely to be the only ones, and I suspect if we need to look anywhere else, we could do worse than start with confluent sites further downstream. Next slide, please. Now, from the high water mark of the early Neolithic, the archaeological signal does seem to diminish during the late 4th and much of the 3rd millennia BC. Where new monuments are built, they tend to be small and rather modest affairs, as at Mayfield Farm and Imperial College Sports Ground on the screen here. And they were perhaps, once again, intended to serve the needs of small family groups. These monuments apart, the clearest archaeological signal at this time is provided by groups of shallow, bowl-shaped pits, backfilled with possibly selected deposits of pottery, struck flint, and charred food remains, principally hazelnut shells and gathered wild produce. Many of the pits contain Middle Neolithic Peterborough ware, which has been widely reported from the region, as the map on the top right there demonstrates. However, the number of pits tail off, or the number of pits tails off over time, so that by the period when flat-based grooved ware is in use, broadly the sort of 3rd millennium BC, the local landscape may have been only intermittently, possibly seasonally, occupied. Now, intriguingly, grooved ware is more common further up the Thames Valley and closer to the area of northern Wessex, where sites like Avebury and Stonehenge were under construction. And one wonders whether the Middle Thames communities had been some of those who journeyed west to work on these major building projects. Next slide, please. Two spectacular finds mark the transition between this apparent dip in the human presence and a renewed cycle of activity out on the terraced landscape, which we'll come on to shortly. The first comprises a beaker burial incorporating gold and jet beads excavated by Wessex archaeology at Lower Horton on the west bank of the River Colne at Kingsmead Quarry. And the second, equally extraordinary find from Holloway Lane, up on the screen here, comprises the remains of a young, partially dismembered aurochs with 6 flint arrowheads embedded in its hindquarters. And I've marked the positions of a couple of the arrowheads on the middle section of this slide there. It had been buried towards the bottom of a deep pit, which had cut through a smaller pit containing more sherds of grooved ware. Now, there seems little doubt that the arrows were the cause of the animal's death, 3 of the 6 on the left of the screen there show signs of damage, with 2 of them, numbers 3 and 5, having sustained impact fractures at their tips, while number 1, the large fine one, was missing its tang, almost as the hunters had tried to recover it from the carcass. Now, unfortunately, repeated attempts by Alex Bayliss to secure radiocarbon dates from the bone proved unsuccessful. There's simply not enough body of bone there to produce a date. But the fancy form of the arrowheads might suggest a late 3rd millennium BC date for the deposit. And the Holloway Lane beast, of course, can be compared with others from places like Eton in Cambridgeshire and slightly later animals buried in similarly large, deep pits at Broome and Willington in Bedfordshire, which you can hopefully see on the right-hand side of the screen. Next slide, please. Now, little diagnostic beaker pottery has been recovered from the West London terraces anywhere. Just 2 sherds from our project and a handful of worn pieces from Terminal 5. But there does seem to be renewed interest in the local landscape during the currency of Unearned pottery. Small discrete groups of pits start to dot the terrace, the terrace surface, the Heathrow terrace surface, often associated with burning linked to mortuary ritual. The group of features at the edge of the Crane floodplain at the eastern end of Cranford Lane, which I put up on the screen here, is a case in point. These include several hearths fired to high temperatures, pits containing burnt materials, including sherds of likely collared urn, a small 4-post structure comparable to others interpreted as mortuary houses or exposure platforms, and token deposits of cremated bone. Comparable cremation deposits have been reported from the Imperial College Sports Ground and from Terminal 5. And the Cranford finds can also be set alongside a flat axe of pre-Araton type from Harlington, just over the hedge, one of very few pieces of this type from the region. Now, this episode of activity could be plausibly connected to the presence of recolonizing communities attempting to renew or to stake their claims to land that had previously reverted to waste or was being exploited at a less than maximizing level. Whatever the true explanation or explanations, the episode clearly predates the laying out of the field systems that form such a notable feature of the local landscape in the later Bronze Age, and to which we can now turn with Nick. So I'm now going to mute myself and Nick is going to take over.
Oh, thank you, John. From around the 16th or 17th century BC, ditched field systems were rolled out across our study area. This formed the greatest human modification of the landscape before the post-medieval period and implies a vast effort and major deforestation. This is seen on our project sites, but also extensively at Terminal 5, Imperial College Sports Ground, Sipson Farm, and on smaller sites, and also to the south on the second terrace at Homer's Farm, Hengrove Farm, and Ashford Prison, which you'll see at the bottom of the slide. It's generally assumed that these fields extended continuously across the study area from the River Colne to the Crane, and probably way beyond on the gravel terraces on both sides of the Thames. In this part of the talk, I should be talking mainly about the most extensive system from the project at Cranford Lane in the top right of this slide. Next slide, please. An extensive coaxial field system defined by ditches and presumably hedges was constructed at Cranford Lane in the 15th or the 14th century BC and continued in use to between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC. This makes it a relative latecomer to our study area, starting some 1 to 3 centuries later than those at Terminal 5 and Imperial College Sports Ground. It had integral droveways, water collection sumps in the western part, and wells to the east nearest the river, and 2 occupation sites of differing dates. Unique in the study area and rare elsewhere, we actually have the edge of the field system, overlooking pasture or water meadows next to the River Crane, not unlike Francis Pryor's site at Fengate. Pardon me. Limited pollen, plant and animal remains indicate that cereal was being grown and processed, emmer, spelt wheat and hulled barley, similar to other sites in the area and further afield at this time, and that cattle and sheep or goat were being raised, as well as pigs and horses. But the droveways provide better evidence for what was clearly a significant pastoral component of the farming regime, and in particular, the gravel metalling of the main route in and out of the eastern entrance of the field system, which you'll see in the bottom right of the plan there, implying intensive cattle traffic. Next slide, please. The orientations at Cranford Lane appear to have been shared by the field systems across an area some 3 kilometres east-west, notably the southern part of Bob Cowie's Sipson Farm site, dug by MoLA, and some smaller sites and crop marks. Next slide, please. But the orientations of the system at Imperial College Sports Ground differ from those at Cranford Lane, but importantly demonstrate the joining up of two initially separate systems within Bob Cowie's site at Sipson Farm. There are different characters to the field layouts at Cranford Lane, Imperial College and Terminal 5, perhaps not best brought out by this slide, but this appears to demonstrate the lack of any overall control and planning. Instead, piecemeal, episodic enclosure of the study area that eventually met and joined up over a period of a few centuries, not a single rapid event organised by one central controlling group. Next slide, please. The enclosure ditches at Cranford Lane and Holloway Lane incorporate a variety of stock control features, similar to those identified by Francis Pryor at Fengate and seen on many other sites of the period. The simplest were simply entrances in the right-angled corners of fields, making it easier to herd animals through, as you'll see in the top row. These apparently led to a more developed type, with the ditches curved to form a deliberate funnel, as in the bottom row. Next slide, please. And then this led also to more complex types with multiple entrances and often post holes for valve-like gates or temporary hurdles, allowing movement to different locations and animals to be sorted into different groups, perhaps comparable to the examples, the modern examples in these photos at the bottom of the slide. Other types, not shown here, are widely varied and perhaps local solutions to specific situations or requirements. Few are more closely dated than to the Middle to Late Bronze Age, but where they are, very tentatively, suggests that the curved funnel type may have developed from the earlier right-angled type in the early first millennium BC. New slide, please. There were 11 so-called cooking pits at Cranford Lane. They contained highly variable quantities of burnt flint and charcoal. Only one had signs of burning in situ, but half contained burnt clay, presumably from ground-level hearths to heat the flint. Some fills had profiles suggesting that the material had been raked out of them towards one end during their use. Perhaps more did originally, depending on soil and fieldwork conditions and methods. And here I'd like to encourage excavators to section these things lengthways rather than widthways, or better still, quadrant them if they're big enough. And this should helpfully help illustrate these profiles better. These resemble pits and troughs, many associated with burnt mounds, found across Britain, Ireland and northwest Europe. There's ongoing debate and investigation as to their function. They probably had a variety of uses, such as cooking food, perhaps steam bathing, and potentially even brewing or cloth processing. We appear to have two different types from this project. Two long troughs apparently making use of adjacent water sources, one from Cranford Lane, seen on the left-hand side of this slide, and another next to a well at Home Farm in the bottom right-hand corner, which appear likely to have been for heating water, for boiling food, or for any other of the wet functions. The others were smaller, potentially dry heating pits. 9 of these at Cranford Lane, mostly 40 to 100 metres from water sources, and 100 to 200 metres from occupation sites. These may have functioned as dry earth ovens for roasting or steaming food, or possibly as sweat lodges if those did not require much water, but perhaps for some industrial function, such as parching or processing crops. Next slide, please. Roughly 40 bronze casting mould fragments had been discarded in one of 2 wells flanking the exit to the field system at Cranford Lane. We had both inner moulds in finer clay and outer mould wrappers of clay with organic temper, which strengthened, sealed, and held the inner moulds together. There were also 2 crucible fragments, which had been relined, indicating more than one use. Such moulds are fairly rare in this area. Just 1 such fragment, each from Imperial College Sports Ground and Runnymede, 5 from a waterhole at Home Farm 1998, awaiting analysis and publication, and some unpublished material from Chiswick. The location near the east entrance at Cranford Lane appears here to be refuse disposal in a convenient hole in the ground, perhaps whilst an itinerant smith was leaving, rather than a deliberately placed deposit, as has been suggested at, for instance, Springfield Lions. Next slide, please. There were 4 unearned small token cremation burials at Cranford Lane, seen here marked in red, and 1 at Airport Gate in the photograph in the top right. The cremations are radiocarbon dated to the 16th to 10th centuries BC, which compares to those at Imperial College Sports Ground and Terminal 5, and to PCA's larger cremation cemetery just east of the River Crane at Western International Market. This dating corresponds to an almost complete decline in this burial practice in the early 1st millennium BC across most of England. These apparently random, isolated locations spread across the fields may well have had meaning for the deceased or for those who buried them, and they may have reinforced connection and ownership rights with this area of the enclosed landscape. The presence of ancestors physically within the fields may also have had a more spiritual or intangible meaning, perhaps exerting a protective function over animals or crops. Next slide, please. At Cranford Lane, there was alluvium representing localised flooding over the lower east side of the site, closest to the river. The site was apparently abandoned, except perhaps as pasture, between or shortly after 800 to 600 BC, and not reoccupied until late in the Roman period. Agriculture and settlement may well have moved just a short distance uphill at this time, outside the site boundaries. This may be related to climate change. Wetter conditions have been suggested for Britain and Europe at this time, for example by Tony Brown in 2008. But this could also have been a result of relatively localised soil erosion from human agricultural activity in areas upstream or uphill. However, We have evidence of continuity into the mid-first millennium BC at some of the other sites, Wall Garden Farm, Holloway Lane, and Mayfield Farm. And so now over to John to discuss the Iron Age.
Thanks, Nick. Well, it's not unreasonable to envisage the survival of mature Bronze Age boundaries across the landscape, local flooding at Cranford Lane notwithstanding. And this more modern example at Burrows Cross on the western edge of Heathrow, that's the top slide on the right, on the left, survived virtually up until the construction of Terminal 5. It's a photograph I took in the early 1980s and shows a couple of hedges flanking a trackway, a sort of made-up tarmac road. Now, one such landscape feature was noted as a crop mark at Stockley Park, Dorley, which lies on the higher Fourth Terrace gravels to the west of Heathe. Excavation here suggested that the two ditches flanked a central bank, beyond which, and across a shallow valley, lay a small early Middle Iron Age unenclosed farmstead, which was not picked up as a crop mark. The settlement was lucky to survive, actually, because much of the area to its north and west had been dug out for gravel prior to 1973. And the site is now a golf course at the northern edge of Stockley Park, and doubtless the haunt of many Premiership referees, fresh from a hard VAR shift disallowing offside goals. Next slide, please. Anyway, the phasing of the settlement is based on the observed spatial and stratigraphic relationships combined with perceived changes in the ceramics. And this has been underpinned by a series of 29 radiocarbon dates refined by Bayesian analysis, which was undertaken by Alex Bayliss and Francis Healy, and is something of a first for a site of this type and date. The dates suggest that the Stockley Park settlement was initially occupied for perhaps 3 or 4 generations, spanning the 5th to 4th centuries BC, i.e. that is sort of the early part of the Middle Iron Age. And following a short radiocarbon hiatus of up to a generation, the settlement was reoccupied for a further 2 to 3 generations towards the latter end of the 4th century BC. Ceramically, its occupancy spanned the changeover from flint-loaded shouldered jars and bowls to sandy jars and bowls with more rounded profiles and smoother surfaces. Archaeologically, the settlement may have been continuously occupied, with certain structures in use throughout the lifetime of the settlement. Next slide, please. Now, the Phase 1 settlement was underpinned by 15 radiocarbon dates and comprised 2 roundhouses, 7 4-post structures, 6 2-post or linear post structures, a single small rectangular beam slot structure, and several shallow quarries. And these had been preceded by episodic activity embedded within a landscape, an open landscape, seemingly already defined by the embanked feature, which I spoke about earlier, and by other linear ditches orientated on the shallow valley to the southeast of the settlement. The Phase 2 incarnation was supported by 14 dates and comprised also 2 roundhouses, 6 4-post structures, and 5 2-post settings. It occupied the same bounded landscape as that of the earlier phase, although its main axis does appear to have been turned through 90 degrees. At least that's the way the 4 posters seem to line up. Next slide, please. Now, the Stockley roundhouses employed a range of building techniques within a general tradition of circular structures. And judging by the presence of internal features, roundhouses B5 and B7 appear to have been occupied as living quarters, 1 in each phase, while B8 and possibly B6 may have functioned as ancillary structures or stores. Structure B7, which is shown on the slide here, has a southeast aligned entrance and is represented by 2 substantial doorpost holes, each replaced once, and may have been of stake-walled or mass-walled construction. It was encircled by a deep penannular gully, which lay well beyond the projected wall line and suggested a substantially overhung roof. The arrangement of internal space presumably sought to maximise natural light for work and for public use, leaving the darker peripheral areas for personal or private use. The concentration of shallow pits, including two clay-lined examples, 775 and 725, you can see down towards the bottom there, to the left of the doorway, could have been intended to take advantage of the longer hours of daylight available during a summer or early autumn occupancy of the structure. Next slide, please. Now, 4 post structures have been widely recorded on later Bronze Age and Iron Age sites in the area. Their function has been widely debated, although it's generally accepted that most functioned as above ground granaries for the bulk storage of crops and other produce. 4 post-to-post holes from both phases were certainly rich in charred spelt and weed seeds. However, there was a puzzling lack of quernstones from the site in either phase, and this is something that's been picked up on other sites too. Now, the 4 posters could also help to address the size of the community occupying the settlement, if we assume that a modular group of between 4 and 8 structures can be equated with a single extended family, or the needs of a single extended family, as was suggested at Danebury by Barry Cunliffe. Much the same sort of figure can be arrived at if we allow a figure of between 7 to 10 people for each occupied roundhouse, as at Terminal 5. And on this basis, the presence of perhaps up to 10 people might be suggested for Stockley in both phases, although this is likely to have varied depending on the nature and the duration of the occupancy. One small rectangular structure, S14, on the top left of the plan on the screen, just up where, right at the top left-hand corner of that linear plan, as it were, seems too small to have had a practical function. It overlooks a modular group of 5 4-post structures strung out in a line there, while its proximity to a second larger open-ended structure surrounding 4-post structure S10 there may be significant too. Next slide, please. And here it is, top left of the slide. It has clear similarities with other structures often interpreted as shrines or cult buildings, including those in the centre of Danebury Hill Fort and the famous, if famously undated, example at Caesar's Camp, Heath Row, which you can see bottom left of the screen. And it may have been cited, the Stockley structure that is, may have been cited to protect stored produce or overlook stored produce. Other facets of belief may be reflected in the orientation of house entrances, 2 of which face northwest, slightly unusually, as could a small series of place deposits buried within them and in the post holes of 4 post structures. And these modest acts of mundane magic, if such they were, often seem to accompany episodes of closure or termination. Now, Stockley is the best and most complete Iron Age farmstead examined as part of the project, but it was abandoned before the end of the 4th century BC. There's absolutely no other evidence post-dating that date, no Roman, nothing, which suggests perhaps that it was only ever a peripheral or satellite settlement, and perhaps seasonally occupied. Next slide, please. Elsewhere, the story can be extended into the late Iron Age and on into the early Roman period, as at Holloway Lane and Wallgarden Farm to the south on the 3rd terrace, or the Heath Road terrace. At Holloway Lane, there's good evidence for Middle and late Iron Age activity embedded within parts of an earlier open landscape, dominated by a sinuous double-ditched feature, which was interpreted on the site, and I tend to concur, interpreted as a track or droveway. Finds included a small complete pot, you can see on the screen there, placed upright in the lower fill of the southern ditch, and a high bowed brooch with a mock double spring, which you can see top left of the slide, also in the southern ditch. Now, the double ditch feature was clearly influential, and the middle late Iron Age evidence was largely restricted to an open linear zone of activity butting against it to the south. And this zone on the right-hand side of the screen here, this zone comprised a scatter of pits, some of which contained sherds of Stanton Harcourt Cassington-style globular bowls, dating from the 2nd century BC. And you've got a couple of sherds at the bottom of the screen there, together with a complete reconstructed vessel. These are quite unusual finds for this area. Next slide, please. Now, work across West London has recovered a good number of Middle to Late Iron Age aggregated settlement plans of both enclosed and unenclosed type. And some of you, I've put them up on the screen here. We're not yet able really to say how many of these sites were in contemporary use, or for how long, and how many were occupied year-round or seasonally. Sites like Stockley Park and Ashford Prison, east of Staines, may have been short-lived satellites, something that the low phosphate levels associated with the roundhouses at Ashford appear to support. Both Ashford and Stockley had certainly been abandoned prior to the Roman conquest, while others, such as Hengrove Farm, a few hundred metres distant from Ashford, flourished. And a similarly successful trajectory can be suggested for sites at Imperial College Sports Ground and at, at Sipson Farm, At Terminal 5, only part of the Middle Iron Age settlement was enclosed within a ditch in the Late Iron Age and maintained down to and probably beyond the conquest. Now, each of these settlements is unique and has its own unique trajectory, which makes generalizing from a single site unwise. However, taken together, a picture of increasing settlement aggregation does seem to be emerging in the centuries running down to the Roman conquest. And this, of course, culminates in the appearance of still larger aggregated sites close to the Thames, the traditional destination for so many fine objects of Iron Age metalwork, by the way. These include the enclosed sites at Woolwich Arsenal and Uppal Camp on the navigable River Roding, and another seemingly bounded by the Thames on 3 sides at Barn Elms. And the Barn Elms site might well qualify as that West London oppidum that John Kent posited 40 years ago on the basis of coin distributions. Very interesting site. Next slide, please. Now, the Roman conquest, when it came, appears to have had little immediate discernible effect on the West London landscape. The major road linking Londinium to Brentford, Staines and Silchester was probably constructed in the late 40s or early 50s, and some way to the south of most of our sites. But the long-established network of local tracks and droveways, some of which may well date back to the Bronze Age, would almost certainly have remained in use. However, it is possible that if changes of ownership or tenure did occur, then the most likely time for this to have happened would have been after the Boudiccan Rebellion, although such changes would be very difficult for us to detect archaeologically. Next slide, please. Now, something of the local situation at this time can be surmised at Holloway Lane and at Wall Garden Farm, where settlement activity appears to have continued from the Middle to Late Iron Age and into the post-conquest period. At Holloway Lane, on the left of the screen there, activity ultimately coalesced around an irregular ovoid enclosure, G38, which formalised the more open pre-existing arrangement of Middle-Late Iron Age date. Similar irregular enclosures were recorded at Terminal 5, and there also assigned a Late Iron Age to early Roman date. At Wall Garden Farm to the east, activity revolved around a series of more complex rectilinear enclosures linked by a trackway some 20 metres in width, running just east of North, which underwent several phases of minor adjustment. And a similar north-south trackway arrangement of long standing, with similar local adjustments, was recorded by Bob Cowie at Sipson Farm, a kilometre or so to the south. And it's possible, perhaps even likely, that this same arterial route served both settlements, a point that we'll be returning to later. Now, the quantities of building material on both sites, which include some pieces of mud brick and even a small number of tesserae, point to the existence of structures, although these proved characteristically elusive during excavation. I've dotted in a couple of possible sites of some of these buildings on both plans. They probably encompass traditional roundhouses, along with rectilinear timber frame buildings of modest pretension. And it's possible that some of the worn and abraded structural timbers recovered from a waterlogged later Roman quarry at Wallgarden Farm came from the demolition of buildings belonging to this phase on the site. Now, limited evidence from both sites suggests that animal husbandry was based increasingly on the herding of cattle, some kept into their 4th year, and the cultivation of spelt wheat and hulled barley. Now, this combination is increasingly noted on farmsteads across the London basin at this period, and one that may have been driven by the need to supply burgeoning new markets, perhaps via the local centres at Staines and Brentford. The status of the inhabitants, whether owners, tenant farmers, peasantry, or enslaved, is unclear. But the creeping adoption of Roman material culture, as reflected in the finds assemblages, is suggestive of an aspiration to a wider Romanitas on the part of some, though whether the various objects were necessarily used in Roman ways is quite another matter. In any case, members of these communities would probably have continued to owe strong allegiances to deeper and much longer established ties of kinship, occupation, and sense of place, and perhaps true change only came about as these faded over time. Now, for whatever reasons, the simple enclosed site at Holloway Lane fell from use during the 2nd century, while its more complex counterpart at Wallgarden Farm was extended and continued in use well into the late Roman period, alongside another newly established complex farmstead at Cranford Lane, which is where I pass across to Nick to pick up the story.
Thank you again, John. Our pottery dating appears to suggest a decline in the project sites between the late 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD, whilst activity at Holloway Lane had ceased almost completely in the late 2nd century. That at Wallgarden Farm apparently also declined in the late 2nd century, at a time when an economic decline has been suggested for Londinium and Roman Britain generally. But at Wallgarden Farm, activity recovered again in the 3rd century. However, it's unclear if this dating truly represents a hiatus in economic activity on these sites. It may simply be a relocation of settlements within the wider farmed landscape, or perhaps just issues with the pottery assemblages. The 3rd and 4th century AD evidence from the project is largely confined to Wallgarden Farm and Cranford Lane, on which I shall be concentrating in the rest of this talk. Thank you. Despite any possible hiatus, the earlier Roman enclosures at Wallgarden Farm were apparently expanded and modified during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. One of a series of large quarry pits produced some 50 worked timbers, dated to or after AD 250. A very large amount of 1st or 2nd century roofing tile may suggest an earlier building in this area, from which some of the more abraded structural timbers may also have come. The highly varied objects included parts of a mortised base plate, perhaps from a wall, seen here top right, a mortised fence or door timber with potentially a ha-hung door pivot at one end. Next slide, please. An oak ladder, seen left, with irregularly spaced rungs, is one of only 4 other runged ladders from Roman Britain. And we also had an oak fence pale with a spear-shaped terminal seen here in the centre, similar to several examples from Londinium. For example, PCA's Draper's Gardens, seen reconstructed top right, and also MoLA's Regis House site. New slide, please. The site at Cranford Lane apparently remained largely abandoned after the Iron Age flooding, and perhaps just used for pasture in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. In probably the later 3rd century AD, the site began to be enclosed with ditched fields, probably including a trackway to the south, and was reoccupied in a small enclosed farmstead found here, seen here in the brighter red colour in the centre. Subsequently, an irregular aggregate enclosure system accreted around the settlement, probably after AD 350, suggesting an intensity of activity in the last half century or so of Roman rule. Next slide, please. Within the 85-metre long ditched enclosure, 3 wells, remains of a possible timber building, along with pottery, including mortaria and colander fragments, and roof tile imply occupation. The building, and perhaps others, were probably modest structures with shallow timber foundations, wattle and daub walls, and at least some tiled roofs, covered with the reused tiles dating back to AD 50 to 160 that we found, and rather more modest than the building from Terminal 5 seen in the bottom right-hand corner here. Amongst the finds, a fluted yellow and blue glass bead from a Roman post hole only has parallels of Saxon date from eastern England and the continent. If it's not intrusive, it would be the first securely dated example from Roman Britain. Next slide, please. 2 small pits 5 metres apart, just inside the boundary of the occupation enclosure, contain unusual deposits. One contained what appears to have been a deliberate deposit of 7 small irregular coins of negligible value by the time that they were deposited, seen here on the left. The second pit contained an eclectic array of scrap metalwork that may also represent a deliberately placed deposit. The miscellaneous group of metal items have been placed neatly in one side of the base of the pit. These include an unusual lead ring with some iron rings and fragmentary chain links pushed into its centre, an iron plate and some loose fragments of iron. Other, more perishable items could have been placed in the other half of the pit. Finally, an unusual large hooked iron blade and handle, perhaps a 2-handled bill or pruning hook, had been laid horizontally towards the top of the pit, immediately overlying the other items. Both pits are dated to the second half of the 4th century AD, or possibly somewhat later if the coins and pottery had remained in use into the early 5th century. The pits need not have been contemporary, despite their proximity, but both appear to have had a votive or symbolic function rather than simply refuse disposal. In particular, the juxtaposition of coin and metalwork hoards echoes a similar pair from Dorchester-on-Thames. This appears to have been part of a pattern of placed deposits of metalwork in late 4th century southern Britain. Either, or both, could have been placed, for example, as a foundation deposit when the farmstead was added to or expanded, or during the life of the settlement in response to other motivations that we can't now determine, or as a closing deposit at its abandonment. Next slide, please. There is no evidence for a villa in the study area, nor anywhere else immediately around Londinium. Instead, we find non-villa farmsteads such as those seen at Wargarden Farm and Holloway Lane and Cranford Lane, and in particular at Terminal 5 and probably at Imperial College Sports Ground and Sipson Farm. These sites lie within a spider's web of droveways and Roman roads leading to and from Staines, Brentford and Londinium. Next slide, please. The wide trackways, seen to some extent at Wargarden Farm and more clearly elsewhere in the study area at Imperial College, Sipson and Terminal 5, suggest the transport of large numbers of cattle, some to what appears to have been a cattle trading centre in Staines, and then on to Brentford, Londinium and perhaps beyond. Whilst these reconstructed droveways are largely speculative, I would like to argue for the resurrection of the hypothesised route from Imperial College Sports Ground via Cranford Lane to the eponymous river crossing at Cranford, first proposed by Andy Crockett of Wessex Archaeology in London Archaeologist back in 2002, but later dismissed in the site publication, apparently on the grounds that it had not been found in the initial work at Cranford Lane. However, a route linking Imperial College Sports Ground and the river crossing now appears to be more plausible, passing largely through unexcavated areas at Cranford Lane and parallel to some enclosures there, to cross the Crane at the same point as the extrapolation of a smaller track from Sipson Farm. Next slide, please. Righto. As we're running over somewhat, I shall skip quickly over this slide, except to say that the Saxon evidence lies beyond the cut-off date for our project and has already been analysed and published by Bob Cowie and Lynn Blackmore for MoLA. And you'll see their publication cover top left. Next slide, please. By the early medieval period, large parts of the Heathrow area may have been abandoned and become heathland, while Saxon settlements became the medieval and modern villages, such as Sipson, Harmondsworth and Harlington. It might be thought that the early past had disappeared entirely from view or from memory by this time, but not so. If we look at the boundary of Harmondsworth parish, marked here in pink, probably laid out in the 8th or 9th centuries AD, we see that it encompasses a series of prehistoric landscape features. These were apparently used as markers where other topographic features, like streams or breaks in slope, were absent. They include Caesar's Camp and Fern Hill, and part of a small burrow cemetery at Imperial College Sports Ground and Sipson Farm, further to the north. Away to the west at Terminal 5, a stretch of Bronze Age field boundary ditch was apparently pressed into similar service. Next slide, please. And finally, we'd like to thank all of those who've worked on this series of sites in this project and those who subsequently worked on and contributed to the long-running post-excavation programme. Thank you.
That was fantastic, a complete tour de force. Now, do we have any questions from the floor for Nick and John? There's nothing yet in the Q&A box or the chat box that I can see.
I'm happy to ask one, Jane, if you haven't got any. But,
go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. Both of you, really, if I may. Can I just echo what Jane says? It was a lovely talk, and it was great to see essentially all those sites being brought together over that very long period. Changes in population are very interesting, obviously, and just two things I'd like to say, if I may. First of all, clearly when the Roman armies invade, and clearly they're going to make a province out of Britain, they do finish up by having 4 of their legions stationed in Britain. The general tradition is for legionary soldiers to retire in the provinces where they serve. So you've got something like 1/10 of the Roman army assigned to Britain, which is, won't go into now, but it's obviously very big. We also know that there are a large number of regiments of Britons, more or less created not long after the conquest and sent out to serve mainly on the Rhine and the Danube frontiers. Now, I do wonder, and I'll just add here that wonderful writing tablet that suggested the so-called 5-acre wood in Kent, which suggests that by about 100, you've already got Roman citizens, probably veterans, given land in Britain. And I just do wonder whether what you might do if you're the Roman authorities is that you actually take the young males from, of course, we have no literary evidence really about the way things are done, but you could take the young males out and send them to serve as auxiliaries in these regiments, and perhaps move your veterans in, perhaps through marriage, to take over farming land that's there. So I do wonder whether there is a move, much like we have that evidence from Kent, we haven't got it from anywhere else, but whether there is a movement of Roman citizens, ex-soldiers, moved into Britain. And then at the other end, I think at Nick's end of the story, really, we do know, for example, from the Emperor Probus, that large numbers of defeated Vandals and Burgundians and their families, defeated between the Rhine and the Danube, are settled in Britain, if we can believe the quotes, and given land to farm. And one does wonder whether, again, because we've got Nick mentioned the possibilities of some form of decline somewhere in the middle of the period. We've got very little hard evidence of anything, but we do know of them being here. So, and they are likely to be given farming duties, because it's the farming produce which is going to be very, very essential, not only to support the authorities in Britain, but possibly even on the Rhine frontier itself. So I just wonder, sorry, it was a long question, but I just wonder whether we actually have movement of people in and out, and that might be difficult to demonstrate apart from the Roman materials on these sites. But I do wonder if this happens generally within the province, that these sorts of changes are made. No evidence of it, but presumably, but certainly plenty of evidence of Roman material finding its way onto these sites.
Well, yes, there is quite a bit of material evidence, but it's quite scrappy, actually. This is the problem with these sites, in that they are quite fugitive, a lot of this stuff.